The steam from my father's pasta curled into the chandelier light like a white flag, and still no one surrendered the conversation. Jason waved his fork, talking about investors he'd nearly landed, while my mother's hand rested on his shoulder, as if she were steadying a trophy. My wine glass sat untouched beside my plate, sweat collecting at the stem. Every time my brother said app or funding, my parents leaned in, eyes bright, heads nodding in unison. When I mentioned a new client, the room didn't shift. Even the clock over the pantry ticked past me, indifferent and precise. Then my dad chuckled, glanced at my mother, and said what I've heard in 1,000 small ways since childhood. "Taylor, you'll never be as good as your brother, but that's okay." My mother smiled, a soft, agreeable smile. The laugh traveled around the table and made a home right in my chest. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever felt yourself disappear in your own family, tap that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. But to understand why that laugh finally cut deep enough to change everything, you need to know where the quiet started. I grew up on a maple-lined street outside Chicago, where the porches all had wind chimes and every garage smelled faintly of motor oil. My father kept a push broom by the door and a level hanging in the basement, and if anything could be measured, he measured its shelves, fence boards, even our report cards laid side by side on the oak kitchen table. Jason's side of that table, from Little League on, was crowded laminated certificates, glossy team photos, once even a newspaper clipping with his smile large enough to eclipse the headline. Mine was tidy, and neat A's lined up like soldiers across the page. Dad would glance, grunt, "Good job," and reach for a pen to sign whatever permission slip I'd slid forward. I didn't need congratulations, I told myself. I needed the quiet hour after dinner when Grandma Ruth would call and ask about fractions like they were secrets. "Numbers are honest," she'd say, her voice carrying that cinnamon and coffee warmth even over the phone. "They don't raise their voice to be heard." She'd worked 40 years as a bookkeeper at a machine shop, the kind of place where paychecks were folded once and slipped into shirt pockets. She let me help balance her checkbook on Saturday afternoons, at her kitchen table, the columns of figures more comforting than any lullaby. "Solid gold," she told me once, tapping her finger against my open palm. "That's what you are, Taylor. Not flashy. Solid." At home, the flashy side of life had a reserved seat. Jason's trophies marched across the living room shelf, all swinging bats and gold plastic shine. Birthdays came with different expectations. On my 16th, I unwrapped a graphing calculator, a cardigan for presentations, and a refurbished laptop that whirred like an old ceiling fan. 3 months later, for Jason's 20th, a set of keys slid across the table in a velvet pouch. "He needs it for college," my mother said, her hand fluttering like a leaf. "When you're his age, we'll see." I nodded. I learned to nod the way some kids learn to whistle. College arrived and showed me how far nodding could carry a person. The University of Illinois at Chicago felt big and honest. The CTA rattled past my dorm at night, and the city's breath came through the window like a steady tide. I stocked shelves at the campus bookstore, tutored algebra on weekends, and stretched every dollar like taffy. My parents sent what they could and called it even, but even is a word that depends on who's holding the scale. Jason sent selfies from places with domed churches and sunlit courtyards. My phone records say, "Congrats on Dean's List." My memory says the line went quiet while Mom told me Jason had met a dean at a networking event and might be on a fast track. When I graduated, Grandma's pearl earrings felt heavy in my hand. Heavier still after she passed 3 months later. She left a note in that tidy ledger handwriting. "Remember, your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it." I folded the slip of paper and slid it behind my driver's license. Sometimes I think it was the most valuable thing I owned. The first year after college, I lived in a studio apartment that smelled like radiator heat and old paint. My desk was a folding table. My bed creaked when I rolled over. My microwave had exactly one useful button. I started at Marshall Financial Services with a cubicle that hummed under fluorescent light, And I learned the choreography of other people's money, how to make sense of the part they were afraid to look at. When my first bonus hit, not much, but mine, I ran my fingers over the numbers as if they might vanish. That's when the calls began. "Sweetie, your brother has an amazing opportunity," my mother said. Voice pitched high, as if speaking into one of those glass cloches that protect delicate things. Just until his first paycheck. It was $1,000. I had planned to send that to my student loan servicer. Instead, I typed his account number into my banking app and pictured a bridge I was building plank by plank towards some imagined fairness. Later, it was another $2,000 for a wardrobe that said director before he was one. Then a car repair. Then 3 months of office rent for a lease signed on hope. Whenever I looked at the memo security deposit business expenses car repair, I added a color to a spreadsheet I kept only for myself. When I visited the address of his office one spring afternoon, just to feel proud out on the sidewalk, the truth came through the glass like a bright slap. A high-rise with a doorman, floor-to-ceiling windows, lobby orchids paid to bloom. I stood watching my reflection blur in the polished brass of a revolving door, while people in suit jackets moved around me talking into the air. At home that night, I added the numbers and had to sit on the floor with my back against the cabinets because the tile felt cool and the room felt tilted. 63,000 in 3 years, then more, always more, braided through holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners where my parents beamed at a future that kept not happening. It would be simple to say I was angry, but anger is loud, and I was taught to be quiet. What I felt had weight, but no shape, something like standing under a storm that never breaks. When I broached repayment, my mother smoothed her napkin and said it wasn't a great time, that Jason was under stress, that I was doing so well. My father called my job the number factory and laughed in that fond way that tells you not to take yourself too seriously. When an article in a local business magazine ran a profile of our advisory team, my parents set it on the coffee table like mail. Jason's old Little League photo still hung over the mantel. There's a kind of practice you get from being the capable one. You learn to move quietly around other people's disappointments to straighten things before they're crooked to carry extra in case the bill arrives early. Capability feels like pride until someone treats it like an inexhaustible well. Then, it's a rope you keep handing out until you notice the skin of your palms is gone. I began waking on Sundays with a tightness in my chest that made the air feel stingy. The phone would vibrate Mom's photo, Dad's, sometimes Jason's, and I'd flip it over and study the hairline crack in my screen like a map. At work, competence has a sound. It's the click of someone's pen when they stop taking notes and start asking you questions. It's the hush when you finish explaining a plan and the client says, "That makes sense." Linda, my boss, once paused at my doorway with a paper cup of coffee and said, "You're clear, Taylor. That's rarer than smart." The compliment sat on my desk like a warm lamp. I liked how it lit the room. There were days I almost carried that light home. But the family dinner tradition is its own weather system. You arrive with clear skies, the pressure drops at the door. April's dinner started the same way it always did, porch light on at dusk, the familiar creak of the storm door, my mother calling out from the kitchen. "We're trying something new tonight." The house still smelled like lemon oil and laundry detergent. I chose the same chair I'd taken since high school. My father fussed over a saucepan like he was training for a competition. Jason texted he'd be late. Big meeting ran over and came in 45 minutes later in a jacket that made the room look cheaper. He talked. He always talked about user acquisition, about sticky engagement, about a guy from San Francisco who knew a guy who'd taken a company public. My parents leaned forward, hunger lighting their faces. When I mentioned I'd secured the Bradshaw account, 7 figures named for the family that owned half the riverfront, they smiled the way you smile when a child brings you a drawing and you're busy at the stove. Stable Mom said, which was the word she used to describe sensible shoes. I watched the steam lift from the pasta and listened to the clock's soft metronome. The chandelier hummed the way old fixtures do when dimmed low. Jason said California and expensive in the same sentence, and I felt my muscles do that small, involuntary thing they do before a blow. Dad reached for his glass, laughed as if we shared a joke, and gave me the line like a hand on the head. "Not everyone can be developing the next big thing," he said. "You'll never be as good as your brother, but that's okay. The world needs accountants." My fork paused midair. A strand of pasta slipped back onto the plate with a soft tap. Mom chuckled, reached to brush crumbs from the tablecloth that weren't there, and looked at me with a sweetness that had always been costly. I learned as a child that silence can pass for grace. I kept still, counted 3 breaths, and reached for my napkin. Something inside me, the part with Grandma's handwriting folded into it, sat up straighter. I thought about the January property tax payment that came from my checking account, the memo clearly typed. I thought about the night I stood outside the building with the doorman watching the elevator numbers blink like a slot machine. I thought about my father's level in the basement, the bubble sliding to center only when the shelf was truly straight. The room felt slightly crooked. My glass left a full ring on the table. My mother turned to me, polite as a hostess, and asked if work had been good. I said yes. I wanted to say, good is not the word. I wanted to peel back the tablecloth and lay down a ledger, each line item solemn as a gravestone. I wanted to ask whether love is love if it only applauds the loudest voice. Instead, I lifted my napkin and pressed it lightly to my lips. People think injustice is a shout. Sometimes it's a laugh that doesn't reach you. Sometimes it's your own voice, so used to being quiet that you don't recognize it when it asks for space. The chandelier hummed. The pasta cooled. Jason reached for seconds, like consequence didn't have hands. I placed my napkin on my plate and slid my chair back an inch. The chair leg caught on the rug and made that small, hollow sound wood makes when it knows it's being moved. "Everything okay, honey?" my mother asked, tipping her head the way she does when she's reading a recipe. I nodded, because nodding is a skill you never quite lose. I reached for my phone, felt the outline of the spreadsheet in muscle memory, and caught my father watching me with that accommodating, harmless pride, reserved for children who don't make trouble. Outside, the porch light had come on slow and automatic, as if the house had sensed the dark before any of us did. The dog 2 doors down barked once and went quiet. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a train line sang its thin steel note. I slid the phone back into my purse. I'd spent years making the numbers balance. The room waited for me to swallow and agree. In the glass of the cabinet, I saw us all reflected, the trophies, the portrait from Jason's senior night, the clock at its slow work, and I saw the empty space left of center, where nothing had ever hung. "Everything's fine," I said, but the words tasted like a coin. Under the table, my hand flexed against the purse strap until the tendons hummed. The laugh still lingered in the air, warm and careless as steam. I watched it rise and fade, and in that fading, I recognized something I had not let myself name. "The numbers don't lie," Grandma used to say. "But they will sit quiet forever unless someone reads them aloud." The clock ticked on. The chandelier trembled in the warm air. I folded my napkin once more, edge to edge, the way she taught me to make a clean line, and I let the room move around me while a different kind of balance settled in my bones. When I finally lifted my eyes, Jason was already telling a new story, and my parents were already leaning in. The night went on as if nothing had happened, but that was the first untrue thing. I stood to help clear the dishes, and the chair legs made that hollow sound again, louder now, like a note struck on an empty glass. My hands were still trembling by the time I reached my car. The laughter from that dinner clung to me like a damp coat. When I turned the key, The headlights caught the familiar siding of my parents' house, the curtains drawn, everything looking exactly the same as it always had. Only, I wasn't the same anymore. The quiet drive back into the city felt longer than usual, the kind of drive where you notice how the streetlights flicker on, one by one, as if the world itself is trying to keep you awake. By the time I pulled into the garage under my building, the air inside the car had gone stale. I sat there a long time before I could move. The anger had cooled into something heavier, an ache under the ribs. I walked into my condo, turned on the kitchen light, and just stood there. It was clean, neat, everything in its place. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had built this life brick by brick, number by number, and somehow I still felt small inside it. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the city still quiet. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the glow from the under-cabinet light tracing a halo around the steam. My phone buzzed on the counter, 7 missed calls, 4 texts. Mom, Dad, Jason. Each message carried a different tone: confusion, guilt, frustration. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and brought up the spreadsheet, the one I'd avoided looking at for months. Every entry sat in perfect order, every payment neatly documented. The numbers didn't lie. $97,436. I whispered it out loud just to feel the weight of it in the air. Later that day at work, I tried to lose myself in numbers that didn't belong to me. Clients called, reports needed reviewing, and yet every conversation felt like talking through water. When Linda stopped by my office, she looked at me for a long second before speaking. "You okay, Taylor?" she asked, her voice careful. I told her I was fine. The word came out flat, like a coin dropped on tile. She didn't press further, just left a small peppermint on my desk before walking away. That night, I found myself scrolling through my phone without purpose. My friend Andrea's name appeared on the screen. She'd texted earlier, just a simple, "How did dinner go?" I called her back, even though it was late. The line clicked, and her voice came through soft, with sleep. "Hey, you sound tired." I told her everything, the laugh, the words, the look on my brother's face when I spoke. There was a long pause before she said, "It's about time you stopped letting them drain you." I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to argue, but another part was too worn out to pretend. The following days passed in a strange stillness. I kept my phone on silent and went through the motions of work like a machine that hadn't noticed it was running out of fuel. On Friday evening, after another 12-hour day, I came home to find Jason leaning against my car in the garage. He straightened when he saw me, his smile tight. "We need to talk," he said. The sound of his voice made something inside me go cold. I tried to step around him. "There's nothing to talk about." "Really?" His tone sharpened. "You humiliated me. Mom's been crying all week. Because she found out the truth, I asked quietly." He scoffed. "You didn't have to do it like that. You made me look like a liar." I looked at him, really looked, his pressed jacket, his restless hands, that same easy confidence that had once charmed everyone. "You are a liar, Jason. You took money you never earned and let them believe it was yours." He flinched, but recovered quickly. "You think you're better than me because you sit behind a desk counting other people's money." "No," I said. "I think I'm finally not worse." His jaw tightened. When I turned to unlock my car, he grabbed my arm. It wasn't hard enough to bruise, but it stopped me. "You've ruined everything," he said. His voice low, almost shaking. I met his eyes. No, Jason. I just stopped pretending it wasn't already ruined. I pulled free and got into the car. He stood there for a moment before walking away, his reflection disappearing in the rearview mirror. That weekend, the silence in my condo was too loud. I cleaned, reorganized the cabinets, even repotted a plant that didn't need it. Every few hours, the phone buzzed with new messages, my parents pleading for peace, Jason alternating between apology and accusation. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I scrolled back to an old voicemail from Grandma Ruth. I'd saved it years ago, though I rarely played it. Her voice filled the room, thin and warm through the speaker. "Remember, sweetheart," she said, "numbers tell you where things stand, but people tell you who they are." The recording ended, but the words didn't fade. On Tuesday, my parents showed up unannounced. I saw their car through the blinds before they even knocked. For a minute, I considered pretending I wasn't home, but old habits die hard. I opened the door, and there they were, Mom clutching her purse like a lifeline dad with that same forced calm that always appeared before a difficult conversation. "Can we come in?" he asked. His voice carried an uncertainty I hadn't heard before. They sat on the edge of the couch, looking around the room as though they were guests in a stranger's home. "This is a lovely place," Mom said. I nodded. "I've lived here 4 years. The words hung between us. Dad cleared his throat. "Taylor, we've been doing a lot of thinking." "About what happened?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "We owe you an apology." I didn't speak, just waited. Mom's eyes glistened. "We didn't know about the money. Jason told us he was helping us out, that his business was finally taking off." She shook her head slowly. "We wanted to believe it." "You needed to believe it," I said. Dad looked down at his hands. "We expected him to be successful, and we took you for granted because you never seemed to need us." I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the tremor in my own voice. Needing you was never safe. Every time I asked for acknowledgement, it turned into a comparison. Mom reached for my hand, but stopped halfway. "We were wrong," she said quietly. "We thought encouraging him was helping him. We didn't see what it was doing to you." The apology wasn't perfect, but it was the first honest sound I'd heard from them in years. We sat there in a long silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally, Dad said, "We've asked Jason to move out. We're trying to understand how deep this goes." Mom's eyes filled again. "He's angry, keeps saying it was temporary, that he planned to pay you back." I nodded once. That sounds like him. They left not long after promising to call when they'd made sense of everything. When the door closed, I leaned against it and exhaled. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. The city outside was settling into evening, the sky turning from gray to blue to something darker. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel responsible for the silence that followed. Days slipped into weeks. At work, I focused harder than ever, channeling the noise inside me into clean columns of numbers. My performance improved, clients noticed. Yet the quiet parts of life still echoed: family dinners, gone phone calls, unanswered, the hollow space where obligation used to sit. One evening, Andrea came over with takeout and a bottle of red wine. We ate on the couch with our shoes off, laughing softly at nothing. When she asked how I was, I told her the truth: I don't know yet, but it feels lighter. She smiled. That's what happens when you stop carrying other people's weight. The next few weeks brought a wave of phone calls from extended family. Aunts, cousins, even an uncle who'd always sided with Jason. Everyone had an opinion. Some offered sympathy, others whispered that I'd gone too far, airing family matters. I listened, said little, and ended the calls politely. Every time I hung up, I thought of Grandma's words again. People tell you who they are. Jason didn't call. When I saw his name on the caller ID one morning, I let it ring. Later, a message came through. His voice was flat defensive. "You've destroyed our parents," he said. "Hope you're happy." I deleted it without finishing. On the first truly warm day of spring, I left work early and walked along the river. The city glinted under the afternoon sun. Children ran ahead of their parents, couples shared soft laughter over coffee cups, and for once, I wasn't rushing anywhere. I stopped at a bench near the bridge, closed my eyes, and let the breeze move through my hair. I thought about all the years I'd spent chasing a kind of love that depended on performance, on keeping everyone comfortable, but myself. Somewhere between the hum of the water and the faint chatter of passing strangers, the thought finally settled I didn't owe anyone proof of my worth. That night back in my condo, I opened Grandma's ledger again. Between the brittle pages, her note weighted the ink slightly faded, but still legible. I read it once more this time aloud. "Your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it." The words didn't make me cry anymore. They made me breathe. I set the note beside a candle and watched the small flame flicker against the glass. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't accuse or demand, just exists. Somewhere outside, a siren faded into distance, and the city carried on. I didn't know what would come next, only that I wasn't returning to who I was before that dinner. When I turned off the light and walked toward my bedroom, I passed the framed photograph on the hallway shelf, the one of Grandma and me at her kitchen table, our hands both resting on her old checkbook. The corners of the photo had curled slightly over the years. I straightened the frame, let my fingers rest against the glass for a moment, then turned away. In the darkness, the hum of the refrigerator sounded steady and sure. For the first time in my life, it didn't feel like the background noise of waiting. It felt like peace learning the shape of a home. The morning air carried a hint of late spring rain, that soft, metallic scent that seeps through city windows before a storm. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my thoughts were louder than sleep. The apartment felt different, lighter maybe, but still unsettled. My phone lay face down on the counter, a habit I'd developed to quiet the constant buzz of family updates I wasn't ready to read. At work, I moved through the day on autopilot. The Bradshaw account had grown faster than expected, and the team was expanding, but I could tell my focus had shifted. I wasn't working for approval anymore. I was working to build something that belonged to me alone. Numbers had always given me comfort. They never lied, never changed the story depending on who was in the room. Still, by the time I returned home that evening, the silence in the apartment pressed heavy against my chest. I poured a glass of water, stood at the window, and watched the streetlights blink on, one by one. That's when the thought came, not sudden, but steady. I didn't have to keep doing this alone. Grandma Ruth had always said that isolation wears a person thin, even the strong ones. I set the glass down and opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I searched anyway. Adult children of difficult parents support groups. Chicago. The following Tuesday, I sat in a circle of folding chairs in a community center basement. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax, the kind of scent that clings to spaces built for people to rebuild themselves. Around me were a dozen strangers, each holding a paper cup or a notebook. A woman with silver hair introduced herself as Diana. She spoke softly, sharing how her mother had always compared her to a cousin who could do no wrong. Her words cracked something open in me. When she said she spent years trying to earn affection that never came, I felt my throat tighten. Then came Michael, a quiet man with kind eyes, who said his father borrowed money for years, calling it family help, and stopped speaking to him once he stopped sending it. The group listened without interruption. When it was my turn, I hesitated. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I said I'd spent most of my life being praised for being dependable, and somehow that had turned into being used. Heads nodded around the room, not in sympathy, but in recognition. It was the first time I didn't feel like I had to justify my hurt. When the meeting ended, Diana lingered beside me. "It gets easier," she said, touching my arm lightly. "You start to see the difference between helping and losing yourself." I thanked her and meant it. That night, driving home under the soft glow of the streetlights, I realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me without an agenda attached. Days became weeks, and life began to take on a quieter rhythm. My parents were still tentative in their efforts cards on my birthday, short calls that stayed safely on neutral ground. Jason, though, stayed silent. His absence was both relief and ache. I sometimes caught myself wondering if he'd ever understood the depth of what he'd done, or if self-reflection had never been part of his makeup. One evening in early June, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end trembled slightly. "Taylor, this is Elaine, your grandmother's friend. We used to sit together at St. Mark's on Sundays." Her name brought a rush of warmth. I remembered her smile, her lilac perfume, how she always brought lemon bars to Grandma's bridge nights. She said she'd heard bits of what happened through the neighborhood grapevine. "Your grandmother worried about this long before she passed," Elaine said gently. "She saw how things were tilted. She used to say, 'Taylor's the steady one.' I just hope she remembers that steadiness isn't servitude." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I thanked her, my voice catching on the words. She went on, "You remind me of her, you know. She carried everyone for too long, too. When she finally set her boundaries, she was almost 60. You did it sooner. She'd be proud." After we hung up, I sat by the window with the phone in my lap, the city pulsing quietly below. It struck me that Grandma had been trying to teach me that lesson long before I understood it, the one hidden between her neat columns of figures and the way she always paused before writing the final total. Some accounts, she used to say, aren't meant to balance. That night, I pulled out her old ledger from the shelf. The pages had yellowed slightly, the ink faded to a muted blue. Inside, tucked between receipts and handwritten notes, was her letter again. I traced the lines with my fingertip, not reading the words this time, just feeling the imprint of her hand. The edges smelled faintly of cedar from the old drawer it had lived in. In the weeks that followed, I started saying yes to things I would have declined before after-work dinners with colleagues, weekend hikes along the lake, a small volunteer program teaching financial basics to high school students. The classroom smelled of chalk and new notebooks. The students listened with that curious mix of eagerness and restlessness unique to teenagers. When one girl asked how I learned to manage money so young, I smiled. Because someone believed I could, I said, thinking of Grandma, her kitchen table, the smell of cinnamon and coffee. Summer deepened, and with it came small changes I hadn't expected. I found myself sleeping better, laughing easier, even cooking more instead of grabbing takeout between meetings. The apartment felt lived in again, no longer a refuge from the world, but part of it. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit on the balcony and look toward the skyline, the wind brushing my hair across my face, and think about how peace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, small and patient. Still, there were days when guilt tried to slip back in those old echoes, whispering that I'd broken something by standing up for myself. During one of the group meetings, I spoke about it. "I keep wondering if I went too far," I admitted. "If maybe I could have found a gentler way." Michael shook his head slowly. "There's no gentle way to stop being used," he said. "Only honest ways." The room nodded again, and I let that truth settle. By late August, an email arrived from my mother. Short, careful sentences. Your father and I have been seeing a family counselor. We'd like you to join if and when you're ready. I read it twice. Something in me hesitated, not from anger, but from weariness. I didn't trust quick fixes. Still, a small part of me wanted to see if change was possible. I replied that I'd think about it. When the first session came, the office smelled faintly of eucalyptus and paper. The therapist, Dr. Lin, spoke with a calm steadiness that reminded me of water running over stone. My parents sat across from me, shoulders tight, eyes down. Jason joined late, sliding into the chair beside them with an air of practiced indifference. Dr. Lin began simply, "Each of you has carried something unspoken for a long time. We'll start with what you wish the others understood." I looked at my family, the people I'd spent years trying to please, the ones who had never truly seen me, and felt a strange detachment. "I wish you understood that silence isn't peace," I said quietly. "It's surrender, and I'm done surrendering." No one spoke for several seconds. My mother's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. My father exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. Jason shifted in his seat, restless. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered. "Doctor," Lynn nodded toward him. "Intention matters less than impact," she said. "Taylor's been carrying both." The session was raw, awkward, and exhausting. By the end, no one was smiling, but something about the honesty of it made the air feel clearer. Walking out, I felt drained, yet strangely lighter, like standing after sitting too long. Over the next few sessions, truths surfaced that had been buried for decades. My father admitted he'd measured both his children against his own unrealized dreams. My mother confessed she'd enabled Jason because she thought dependence meant closeness. Jason stayed defensive, but even he began to crack under the weight of evidence and silence. After one particularly tense meeting, as we stood outside the building, my father touched my shoulder. "You deserved better from us," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost to the wind. "We're trying to do better now." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was movement. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts. My mother's calls grew shorter, but more sincere. No guilt, no deflection. My father sent me a book on leadership with a note that simply said, "Proud of you." Jason, meanwhile, was learning his own lessons. Without my help, and with my parents' support cut off, he'd lost his apartment and car. A cousin mentioned he'd taken a regular job at a marketing firm. "It's temporary," he told them. But even that was progress. Autumn arrived with its long shadows and cool evenings. I stood one night on the same balcony where I'd once felt trapped by my own quiet. The city lights shimmered like slow-moving stars. I thought about everything that had happened, the confrontation, the fallout, the reckoning. Healing, I realized, isn't a finish line. It's a daily choice. Inside on my kitchen counter, Grandma's note sat beneath a small glass frame. I'd had it pressed and preserved at a shop downtown. The edges were neat now, the handwriting clear. "Your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it." I read it once more, then turned off the lights. The reflection in the window showed a woman still learning, still mending, but standing on her own. The night outside was calm, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I simply let it be. Winter settled over Chicago like a heavy coat, the kind that muffles every sound, until even the city seems to exhale slower. I remember one morning, stepping outside my building and seeing my breath curl into the air, thin, silver, fleeting, and realizing how long it had been since I'd felt the cold without flinching. For years, I'd moved through life braced for the next demand, the next subtle dismissal. but something had shifted. The world still felt heavy, but I was no longer carrying it alone. Our family therapy sessions had stretched into late fall. They weren't easy. Some nights I came home with a pounding in my temples that no amount of tea or silence could calm. But change, I'd learned, doesn't sound like peace. At first, it sounds like friction. In one session, Jason arrived late again, coat half-buttoned, eyes darting around the room. Dr. Lin waited until he sat down before saying, "You've lost a lot this year, Jason. What have you learned from it?" He shrugged, the same careless gesture that had followed him since childhood. "That some people hold grudges longer than others." I could have argued, but I didn't. I'd stopped trying to translate his version of events into truth. Dr. Lin's gaze softened, but didn't waver. Or maybe she said quietly that taking responsibility feels like loss until you understand its freedom. Jason didn't reply. My parents watched the exchange in silence, their faces drawn. Later, as we walked to the parking lot, my father touched my arm and said, "She's right, about freedom. We're all learning it in our own ways." In December, I got a postcard from Jason. No message, just a snowy street scene, and his name scrawled at the bottom. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't silence either. I kept it tucked in my desk drawer. Work filled most of my days. The firm had grown quickly, and my name was beginning to appear on more clients' lips. The Bradshaw portfolio had expanded into several states, and Linda Ever, the steady mentor, began inviting me to strategy meetings usually reserved for senior partners. One evening, after everyone left, she lingered by my office door. "You ever think about teaching?" she asked. I looked up, surprised. "You mean like at a university?" "Not exactly. Community programs, workshops. People trust you, Taylor. You make the complicated feel human. That's a rare gift." The thought stayed with me all night. Maybe it was because teaching felt like passing something forward the way Grandma once had with her ledgers and advice. A week later, I reached out to the same community center where I'd found my support group. By February, I was teaching a small evening class on budgeting and personal finance. 10 students showed up the first night, single parents, retirees, a college kid trying to get ahead of his loans. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and hope. I'd start each session with the same words. Money isn't about numbers. It's about stories. What we believe we deserve, what we're afraid to lose. Every time I said it, I thought of my family, how we'd confused control with care, obligation with love. Outside the classroom, life kept moving. My parents called every Sunday now. Their voices had softened, the conversations no longer filled with tension or guilt. Mom would tell me about her garden dad, about his new habit of walking the lakefront in the mornings. Sometimes they mentioned Jason in passing, how he'd come by for dinner, how he'd started a steady job at a marketing firm downtown. They said he was quieter these days, more subdued, though still restless. I listened not with judgment, but with distance. Then one cold Thursday evening, he called. I stared at the name glowing on my phone screen for a full minute before answering. His voice was low, stripped of its usual polish. "Hey, Tay, I just wanted to say thanks." "For what?" "For not cutting me out completely." I leaned against the window, watching snow drift past the streetlight. "Jason, I didn't do any of this to hurt you. I just couldn't keep pretending anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm starting to get that. Losing the apartment, the car, it forced me to look at myself. Turns out, I didn't like what I saw." He laughed softly, almost self-conscious. "I'm still figuring things out, but I wanted you to know I'm trying." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an apology. But it was the first honest thing he'd said in years. I told him I was glad to hear it. Before hanging up, he said, "Grandma would have been proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I swallowed the lump in my throat and managed to whisper, "I hope so." After that call, something eased in me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the old knots. We didn't become close overnight. We still spoke rarely cautiously, like two people learning to walk on unfamiliar ground. But each conversation ended without bitterness, and that was enough. As spring returned, so did a sense of renewal. I began hiking again, something I hadn't done in years. The first time I reached the lake trail, the air smelled of rain and thawing earth. Birds flitted through the bare branches, their songs scattered and uncertain like the world relearning melody. On one of those walks, Andrea joined me. She'd been my anchor through the hardest months, always steady, never intrusive. We stopped at a bench overlooking the water, watching the ripples catch the late sunlight. "You look different," she said after a while. "Older?" I joked. "Lighter?" she corrected. "Like you stopped apologizing for taking up space." I smiled. Maybe I finally learned what Grandma meant by solid gold. It's not about shine, it's about weight, the kind that keeps you grounded. Andrea nodded. That sounds like something she'd say. We sat there in comfortable quiet, the breeze moving gently through the grass. Somewhere behind us, a child laughed, high, unguarded, pure. It echoed just long enough to feel like a blessing. Back at work, Linda called me into her office one afternoon with a letter in her hand. "You've been nominated for the Midwest Financial Leadership Award," she said. "It's not official yet, but the board loves your community work. I thought you should know." I stared at her, stunned. "I didn't even know I was eligible." "You weren't," she said with a small grin. "But someone put your name forward anyway." When I checked later, I discovered it had been one of my students from the community class, a single mother named Carla who'd paid off her credit card debt and started saving for her daughter's college fund. Her message attached to the nomination form read simply, "She taught me that money isn't about survival. It's about dignity." The night of the award ceremony arrived in late May. The ballroom shimmered with light glasses, clinking soft music humming in the background. I wore a dark green dress Grandma would have loved and a single strand of her pearls. As my name was announced, applause filled the room, but what I heard most clearly was her voice in memory, steady, proud, practical. "Remember, your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it." When I stepped to the podium, I didn't speak about balance sheets or strategies. I talked about what money had taught me about people, about how generosity without boundaries becomes sacrifice, and how learning to say no can be its own form of love. When I finished, the applause felt quiet, almost reverent. Later that night, after the event, I drove home through the quiet streets. The city glowed faintly under a misty sky. My parents called to congratulate me, their voices soft with pride. Jason sent a simple text, "Well deserved." I smiled at the screen, then set the phone aside. Some acknowledgments don't need more words. I reached my building, just as the rain began, light steady cleansing. Inside the apartment was dark, except for the soft amber of the kitchen lamp. I hung my coat, poured a glass of water, and walked to the balcony. The air smelled of wet concrete and lilac. Below, headlights moved in slow, silver lines. For a long moment, I stood there, listening to the rain tap against the railing, the city murmuring below. I thought of Grandma Ruth, of the ledger she'd left behind, of every lesson written between the lines. I thought of the girl I'd been at that dinner table months ago, silent, tired, small, and the woman standing here now, still learning, still whole. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Storms end, and the air clears. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, maybe even new beginnings. But for tonight, I was enough. Morning came with soft, gray light spilling across my bedroom floor, the kind that blurs the edges of everything it touches. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the rain taper off into mist. Below, the streets gleamed clean and new. Chicago looked half awake, still yawning from the night before. For the first time in years, I felt the same unhurried, unburdened, quietly alive. The air inside the apartment carried that faint smell of last night's rain, mixed with candle wax and paper. My award from the ceremony sat on the kitchen countertop where I'd left it, its glass surface catching a fragment of light. I hadn't told many people about it, and maybe that was the point. Recognition was never the destination. It was just the echo of work that had already healed something inside me. Later that morning, I visited my parents. The drive through the suburbs felt almost surreal. Streets I'd memorized as a child now looked smaller, as if time had folded them inward. When I pulled into their driveway, my father was outside sweeping leaves from the front walk. He looked up and smiled, tired but genuine. My mother opened the door before I even reached it, a dish towel still in her hand. The air inside smelled like cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee the way it used to on Sunday mornings before life became complicated. We sat around the same oak table, where so many arguments, silences, and apologies had passed. Only now the space between us didn't feel dangerous. It just felt quiet. My mother poured coffee into mismatched mugs and said softly, "We saw the news article. The award? It's wonderful, Taylor. You've made us very proud." I smiled, not for approval this time, but for gratitude. "Thank you," I said. "It means something to hear that." Dad nodded, his hands folded loosely around his cup. "You were right about everything, about how we treated you, about Jason. I don't expect you to forget it, but I hope you'll believe we're trying to do better." "I believe that," I said. "Trying is a start." For a moment, the three of us sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. I realized that forgiveness in its truest form wasn't an act, it was a decision to stop living in the wound. I didn't need to reopen it or hide it. It was just there, part of the map of who we'd been. Before I left, my mother hugged me. It wasn't the stiff, formal gesture of years past. It was a real embrace, warm and trembling at the edges. "We'd love to come to your next class," she said, half laughing through tears. "I think we could learn a thing or two." "Only if you promise not to correct the teacher," I said, and for the first time in a long while, our laughter sounded like family again. The following weekend, I met Jason for coffee downtown. He looked different, thinner maybe, but calmer. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple shirt and a worn jacket that actually suited him. He stirred his coffee in slow circles, eyes steady but unsure. "I'm working at a marketing firm," he said. "Real work this time. It's not glamorous, but it's mine." "That's good," I said. "Work that's yours always feels different." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and slid a small envelope across the table. "It's not much," he said, "but I've been setting aside something every month. I don't know if I'll ever pay back everything, but I want to try." I looked at the envelope, then back at him. "Keep it," I said gently. "Use it to build something solid. That's how you pay it back." He nodded slowly, his eyes shining a little before he blinked it away. "You really have changed," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I just stopped trying to be small." We left the cafe and walked for a while without words. The air carried that faint lake breeze, sharp but clean, and for once, it didn't sting. Before we parted, he turned to me and said, "Grandma was right about you. Solid gold." I smiled. She was right about both of us. We just had to learn what it meant. The months that followed unfolded gently without fanfare. My class at the community center grew from 10 students to nearly 30. Some evenings, we'd stay late sharing stories about small victories, a paid-off credit card, a balanced budget, a dream no longer postponed. The work grounded me in a way nothing else ever had. It reminded me that what we build for ourselves can ripple quietly into other lives. One night after class, I found a small envelope tucked beneath my papers. Inside was a note from Carla, the student who'd nominated me for the award. It said simply, "You taught us that money can be a language of self-respect. Thank you for helping us learn to speak it." I read it twice, then slipped it into the same frame that held Grandma's letter. 2 generations of women, one living, one gone, both reminding me that real worth, was never about applause. Summer returned in a wash of green and light. I started spending weekends at the lake again, walking the trail I once took with Andrea. One morning, I brought a book and a small thermos of coffee sitting on a bench as the sun came up. The air shimmered with heat, and the soft sound of water lapping the shore. Somewhere nearby, a child's laughter floated on the wind, that same unguarded joy that always makes the world feel possible again. I thought about the journey behind me, the years of trying to earn love, the quiet confrontation that changed everything, the ache that followed. It wasn't a clean story, but it was a true one. I'd learned that sometimes peace doesn't come when the world apologizes. It comes when you stop asking it to. Back at home, the apartment carried the warmth of lived-in peace. The shelf above my desk held small tokens of the life I'd built: the award plaque, a framed photo of Grandma Ruth, a thank you card from my students, and one empty frame waiting for whatever came next. I opened the balcony door, letting in the sound of evening traffic and the smell of rain-soaked pavement. The city lights shimmered on the glass buildings like quiet stars. Somewhere in that glow was the girl I'd once been, the one who sat silent at a dinner table while laughter dismissed her. She wasn't gone. She'd simply grown into someone who no longer needed permission to shine. I sat at the small kitchen table, poured a cup of tea, and took a deep breath. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, balanced in a way that felt honest. The peace I'd been searching for wasn't loud or cinematic. It was the stillness of knowing I had nothing left to prove. Outside, the rain began again, light, rhythmic, almost tender. The sound filled the room like a lullaby. I stood by the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass, and whispered the words Grandma had once written. "Your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it." This time, I didn't just believe her. I knew she was right. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever learned the power of walking away to find peace, share your story too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of love that begins with self-respect. Because sometimes peace isn't something we're given. It's something we decide to keep.